I begin this webinar on the contribution of Pope Leo's encyclical Rerum Novarum, an encyclical that has made a marvellous contribution to our understanding of the dignity and rights of all peoples. And I start this particular session with an acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of the many lands on which we are meeting. I acknowledge our gratitude that we share these lands today, our sorrow for the costs of that sharing, and our hope and prayer that together we can move to a place of justice for all our Indigenous peoples. The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church includes the following passage on Rerum Novarum. Rerum Novarum expounds the Catholic doctrine on work, the right to property, the principle of collaboration instead of class struggle as the fundamental means of social change, the rights of the weak, the dignity of the poor, and the obligations of the rich, the perfecting of justice through charity, on the right to form professional associations. End of quote. It was an extraordinary document. Our speaker today is Father Bruce Duncan. Bruce was ordained for the Redemptorist congregation in 1971. He has been involved in the study and advocacy of social justice. To specialise in these areas of social justice, he studied economics and political science. He gained a Bachelor of Economics honours in 1979 and a PhD in 1987 from the University of Sydney. Since 1986, he has taught at Yarra Theological Union. He has been a member of the Melbourne Catholic Commission for Justice, Development and Peace and a consultant with Catholic Social Services Victoria. He is one of the founders of the advocacy organisation Social Policy Connections and was director of the Yarra Institute for Religion and Social Policy, which has been subsumed into the Centre for Research on Religion and Social Policy within the University of Divinity. Bruce's publications on social justice issues are well known to many of us. Bruce's paper for today has already been distributed. It is an excellent summary of the content and impact of Rerum Novarum. Bruce will speak to the paper for about 25 minutes, after which we will take questions, some of which have already been submitted. After about 45 minutes, that is at about 3:15, we will go to a short presentation by Megan Kavanagh. Megan is chair of the Australian Catholic Council for Employment Relations, which is an agency of the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference. One of the principal functions of ACCER is to make submissions to the annual wage reviews in support of low-paid workers. In short, to promote the wages and social outcomes articulated in Rerum Novarum. Megan is solicitor and a partner in a national law firm. Her main areas of expertise include equal opportunity, discrimination, unfair dismissal, harassment and diversity, work health and safety, and industrial relations. We hope that Megan's presentation will provide some ideas on how we can advocate for decent wages and modern social safety nets in contemporary Australia. After Megan's presentation of about 10 minutes, we will return to questions on both aspects of the webinar. I'll now pass back to you, Stefan.
Thanks very much, Brian. Well, I think we can go straight to Bruce, actually, when you're ready, Bruce.
Certainly, thank you, Stefan and Brian. And welcome, everybody. It's so good to see so many here today, friendly faces and people I've known in the past. So hello to you all. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to commemorate 130 years of Rerum Novarum. Most of you would be very familiar with the document itself and have read it and studied it and perhaps read it many times. But I couldn't help thinking when preparing this talk today of just how relevant it is today. I was reading there just beforehand Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, briefly in April, his personal wealth reached, he's the richest man in the world, as you probably know, $200 billion, not $200 million, but 1,000 times that, $200 billion. And looking down the world's rich list, there are 9 or 10 people who have up to nearly or more than $100 billion in wealth. So we have never seen in the world before such an astronomical concentration of wealth and consequently economic power and political power in the hands of just a few people. So Pope Francis is talking about this a lot, of course, and particularly in view of the fact that the concentration of wealth is systemic. It's built into the system, as leading economists like Joseph Stiglitz and Jeffrey Sachs, many other, Nouriel Roubini, many others have been saying. So the system is working badly, and it's just echoing a lot of the things that Pope Leo was saying in 130 years ago. A few quick words about Leo himself. He had been after he was ordained a priest in Italy, he had been in a civil position as in charge of some of the areas in the Papal States. Remember, in the early 19th century, they were still under the Papal States. So he had experience with civil administration. He was sent to Belgium as the nuncio, Vatican nuncio, for 3 years. But that time, he toured around Europe a little bit. He spent a month in Britain looking at working conditions and so on, and even dined with Queen Victoria. So he was a figure of some stature even at that time. When he returned to Italy, he was appointed to the archdiocese, made an archbishop, and sent to Perugia. And he had because of his role in civil administration, he was more alert than most of the Italians would have been to the conditions of workers. When he got to Perugia, he gradually became more and more interested in these things, and some of his pastoral letters were sort of premonitions of some of the stuff that appeared in Rerum Novarum. So he had this long-running concern about social conditions. So it's, in a way, it's not surprising that he wrote this document as he did, with help from a number of other writers, but he supervised it very closely. And particularly the last 2 weeks before it was finalized, he worked on it intensely, and as he had followed it all the way through. So he was alert to these things. He was also informed by people like Cardinal Manning in London. Cardinal Manning, as you know, put in the paper there, he was instrumental in settling the famous London dock strike. Now this was, we think, oh, well, he settled a strike. But this was not just any strike. Whole of British trade depended on the docks and getting things on and off ships. And you didn't have mechanization that we have now to do it. It was all very hard labor, very physical, very hard, very dirty as well. And the people who were dock workers were regarded as the lowest of the low. It was shocking work, prone to injury. You would be hired on a day. You would go to, it was I forget the term, but you could be hired for a few hours a day, and that was it. So these people lived in terrible conditions. And Cardinal Manning's intervention, the strike went for about 5 weeks, and people were getting very agitated about what was going to happen, whether this was going to erupt into violence. Up to then, it had been fairly peaceful, but the numbers involved, there were 130,000 men out on strike at the end of it. So it was getting very, very big, and people were very anxious. So Manning was called in to be part of the Mansion House committee that was to try to negotiate an end to the strike. And Ben Tillett, who was one of the strike leaders, knew Manning well. And why was Manning so successful in this? At the very last minute, when things seemed to be breaking down and no one could come to any resolution, Manning, as a 90-year-old man, he went in and talked to the strike leaders and convinced them with his personal intervention that this was the way forward. So he convinced why was he able to convince the dock owners? Because his family was connected with that class. His father had been a director and a governor of the Bank of England at one stage. Can you imagine? An MP for 30 years, very well connected with the ruling class of the day. So he came from that family. And also the dock workers, they were about 80% of them were Irish Catholics. So of course Manning, and with his long experience and concern about social questions from his very early days, he'd been an Anglican priest, you recall. His wife died after a few years of marriage, and a decade or two later, he became a Catholic after a doctrinal dispute in the Anglican Church. So the point I'm making here is as an Anglican priest, he was a social activist from his youth. This is Manning. And he brought that social activism into the tradition of the Catholic Church in England because it wasn't there before. And he complains in many of his writings about how the English church is so staid. There was the recusant church, of course, the old Catholics who had survived the Reformation were keeping their heads down. And he complained at one stage he had 200,000 English Catholics, but 1 million Irish Catholics in Britain. So he brought that social awareness into the English church in a way that hadn't been there before. And that underlies a lot of what Rerum Novarum is saying. It reflects a lot of his ideas, and in fact, he took them further. So I did want to just identify some of the key things in Rerum Novarum because they are so relevant to us today. And we live in the age of the gig economy. Wages are stagnant. There's increasing gap between the rich and the poor. Look at what's happened even with the COVID crisis, how some of the very big companies have made astonishing profits. It's just incredible at a time when most people are really cutting their cloth very carefully. So the target for Leo XIII is this laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire, we're all familiar with that. I guess it means laissez-faire, just the French word for let it go, let the market just operate by itself with very minimal regulation, so that just to enforce contracts and protect the right of private property. Well, Leo is coming and saying that's not good enough, and how are we going to change it? He says concentration is very practical because he's aware of these things and being well advised. How do you change the system? Are we due for a revolution? Is that the only way to do it? No, he says. He recognizes the reality of class struggle. He's in no doubt about that. It's all around him. You didn't need Dickens to write his novels to convince him of what the reality of poverty and hunger and injustice was all about. But he's saying, how do we restore equality in bargaining power between workers and owners, so that they can get a just outcome and particularly a just wage. So it comes back to the struggle for a just wage. There were debates about, and there still are, about what constitutes a just wage. And it was reflected in the debates between the writers on the encyclical themselves. Father Liberatore, who was the did the first draft of the encyclical, was insistent that the just wage must be enough to support not just the worker himself, but also his wife and family. We're talking it's all, male world at this time in the working world. And it's a patriarchal age for Leo. So that explains what's happening there. So Liberatore say it must be for the worker and his family. And some of the other writers in the encyclical, particularly Cardinal Zigliara, a man called Cardinal Zigliara, but that's not going to work because that will mean the employers will employ people who don't have a family in preference, so they can pay them less. So he was arguing for a more practical position that all you can demand of justice is that an exchange of the output of the worker and his wage. So, but that didn't include the family wage. So in the document itself, you'll notice that it seems to have it both ways. He says, it must be freely agreed on, enough to support a frugal and well-behaved wage earner without force. If he's made the victim of force, then that's an injustice. But then he says, but if wages would be enough, he puts the, I read this incorrectly earlier. I thought he was saying wages should be enough to enable him, quote, comfortably to support himself, his wife and his children so that he can save for the future. But he's actually got an if the worker is able to support himself, his wife and his children out of that wage. So, and you can read the document either way. It's a nuance that they're trying to cover against, that it won't rebound against people with families, but still to keep the pressure on for a just wage. It became a moot point because everybody, including Manning and out here Cardinal Moran and the other bishops throughout the world, interpreted it as meaning a family wage. And that's how we took it up, certainly in Australia. And the point about it was, is the encyclical goes on, the law should favour ownership and induce as many as possible of the people to become owners. So it's to redistribute wealth and income, or particularly income, basic income, to allow people to save and to accumulate a certain amount of property that would secure them against unemployment, poverty, old age particularly, and sickness and misfortune. So this was the ideal that Leo was promoting, and you see, so that he could see property more equitably distributed. And the way to do this was, he wasn't naive. He didn't, well, he did appeal to the goodwill of employers to make sure they paid a decent wage, but he didn't stop there. He realized that the workers had to aggregate their strength into form trade unions. And he says at one stage that he talks about all the different benefit associations and foundations for orphans and widows and so on. And there were lots of these when I was doing my thesis. I trawled through all the numerous organizations set up by Catholic groups for funeral insurance, unemployment insurance, all sorts of benefit societies has existed that have been, many of them have gone now, but there wasn't the state there to do these things for people and to give them, so they did them themselves. But Leo says the most important thing of all is working men's unions, for they virtually include all the rest of the activities. So he was encouraging Catholics to form unions, well, not just Catholics, everybody to belong to a union so that they could bargain with their employers equally. What about strikes? This is another curious one because Leo himself wasn't in favour of strikes, but of course what had happened with Cardinal Manning and in England with the settlement of the Great Dock Strike, well, you couldn't dispute that, and because Manning had such stature throughout particularly the English-speaking world, that was the way people interpret. They read the document because Leo didn't forbid strikes, but he said they have to be very careful. I just lost the place. Not to result in injustice or violence or disorder. But then he left it unsaid. So when Manning gave his interpretation of the document in London, of course, he interpreted it as justifying the right to strike. Manning, by the way, was with Archbishop Vaughan, he's from Dublin, translated the document into English. And it's very interesting the title he gave it, On the Condition of the Working Classes. So it was very direct, very clear in a way that the Latin title was not, Rerum Novarum. But he wanted to make it clear that this is what it was all about. It was a workers' question, and here was a church saying that not only is it okay for workers to aggregate their strength, and the church to vigorously support this effort to uplift living standards and improve the conditions of workers, but it was essential for the church to be involved. This was part of the mission of the church. So this was a stunning crisis. It was not well received in many parts of Europe, particularly in parts of France, where you might remember Bernanos in his diary of the country priest, he said, remember how it felt, Rerum Novarum felt like an earthquake in the church. It caused such reverberations, and how the people in the parts of northern France he was referring to at the time were regarding it, praying for the Pope as a heretic. So it just shows you that, but of course, for most of the ordinary people, it was very well received because this endorsed their best hopes and aspirations for the future, gave them a hope that there was a way through this situation, out of this dreadful predicament that many people were in. He stressed, of course, that the human dignity of the person. Everybody is precious in God's eyes. This is the most fundamental message of the whole gospel. Everybody is precious. Everybody is valued in God's eyes. And what he asks of us is that we treat other people the same way, treat them as loved by God, precious in God's sight. So this is how it provides the motivation for social action and gives a new depth of meaning to this social action, not just as a secular activity, but this is something willed by God and desired by God. This is a vocation. And of course, these are some things that Canon Cardine picked up very strongly in his work with the YCW. Canon Cardine was particularly insightful in the way that he was able to develop the YCW technique, See Judge Act, as a very concrete way for people who were not well educated. Remember the girls that he started with? They weren't, they were intelligent women, but they had very few educational and social resources on which to draw. So he developed this technique that even people with minimal resources, if they come together, they can build those resources among themselves and develop them and then have an influence on, but always a bit like Pope Francis in this, who of course follows very much, very aligned, and in his documents are very clear, the See Judge Act, the sort of structure in his document. Canon also, Cardine with Pope Francis endorsing that this method must not just be intellectual exercise and not go anywhere. It's aimed to have some definite practical outcome. And I think that's it's key to the success of this method, that it does, if you feel you're achieving something, you're likely to keep going with it. Just a quick word, also there's a lot more to be said, of course, but with our Australian situation was linked in with this, because Cardinal Moran, the Archbishop of Sydney at the time, he gave a lecture, a famous lecture in which he received the message, the document. He didn't even mention socialism in his talk. And of course, the Conservatives were banging on about this, that the Pope, you know, as an anti, for their own political purposes, to try to drive Catholics and others away from social activism. Well, Moran said he ignored the socialism question entirely and concentrated on the reform of capitalism, the right to form a strike, the right to form unions. He reiterated what Rerum Novarum was saying and insisted on the right and need. He gave legitimacy to the Labor movement at a critical moment, just as the Labor Party was forming in New South Wales. And in fact, when he gave his address at the Freemasons Hall on the rights and duties of Labor, there were 35 members of the newly elected Labor Party present in his lecture, as well as other church and civil dignitaries, leading politicians and business people of the community. So Moran's intervention was significant, and thank God it was, because had he come out against the Labor movement, as some of the bishops did overseas, they could have alienated the Catholic workers, particularly from the deep involvement that developed over the years with the Labor reform movement, and led to Australian living and working conditions being much better than they otherwise would have been. Justice Bournes Higgins was the president of the Commonwealth Court of Conciliation, who made the famous 1907 Harvester judgment. Now, Higgins was not a Catholic. He was a son of a Protestant minister. He'd come to Australia at the age of 18, but he was became very interested in Labor matters. And later on, when the encyclical came out, he found a lot of confirmation with what his own ideas were. And he read the encyclical, he lectured on the encyclical, he wrote about the encyclical, and he often gave lectures in the Cathedral Hall in Melbourne. He was very friendly with Cardinal Moran and also with Archbishop Carr at the time in Melbourne. So he's very well connected that way. And he paraphrased part of Rerum Novarum in giving that decision on the basic wage, why was, others can say more about this than I can, but what he did was to determine a set level for what a basic wage was about. People have been talking about a basic wage before this, but nobody had really determined what it was. And he determined that it should be for a household of 5 people and an unskilled worker having at least being able to earn 7 shillings a day. So this became the basis for the basic wage in Australia up to 1965. So it was a very important decision, and it was there was a direct link there with Rerum Novarum. So I think our task is, of course, we're in an entirely different situation today, but if anything, the task is just as urgent, and it's on a global scale now. So, ladies and gentlemen, we've got work to do, I think, and what do we do with this now, and particularly starting from Australia.